I'll just introduce you, and then we'll go from there. All right, guys, we have Dario Nardi with us today. He taught at the University of UCLA from 1998 to 2012 with anthropology and computing. He won the Copenhaver Award for Innovative Use of Technology in 2005, Distinguished Teacher of the Year in 2011, and he conducts hands-on brain research. And he has books, The Neuroscience of Personality. He has The Magic Diamond, which I think is $1 million book, to be honest with you. If you're really trying to elevate your life, I would highly recommend you guys pick that book up. He's also co-authored books from with Linda Behrens. And I think this is probably his first book here by itself. Okay, so Dario Nardi is a well-established guy. So sorry about that, Dario, but yeah, I had to preface that. So Dario, you have your new book coming out, and
yes.
Could you explain what you're diving into there?
Sure. I don't have a title for the book yet. I'm playing with several, so I guess that says where it is. But the meat of the book, the bones, is there, and that is on the subtypes of each type. And that comes out of the brain imaging data now that there are over 500 people of all different types, different ages, mostly from the United States and Europe, but also India. And really seeing that even though specific types are going to have favorite regions, for example, and particular things when they get into flow, that the way the brain is wired, sort of its social network, that seems to depend a lot when people are younger, yes, on gender, but mostly it seems to relate to career and job role, a culture to some extent, some other factors there also. But looking through the data, it was quite clear that there are these not just 4 subtypes within the brain imaging data, and we could say that there are 2, or we could make 8. 4 of those seems to be where I can safely land, because there are other people who have discovered these same patterns. So Dr. Viktor Galenko in Ukraine, who is a socionics type psychologist for decades, and that was a big inspiration. And also the work of Dr. Helen Fisher, who does not use type, although she's aware of who I am, and her work on neurotransmitters and hormones, and also discovered the same 4. And when I looked at them, they just like really lined up very nicely. And finally, there is someone in China also. He's a graduate student now. I mean, he goes to school in the United States at UCLA, actually, and looking at the differences between Chinese and American culture, and seeing that G culture plays a role, because when he took the English version in the United States, he came out in ENFJ, and when he took the adjusted Chinese version, a version of the MBTI adjusted for Chinese culture, he came out what he believes is his correct type, which is INTJ. So he's like, how is it, that the type appears one way in one culture and expresses another way in another culture? So long story short, these are developmental variants. I use the word subtypes because people understand what that means, and probably people have heard the word variant enough during this post-COVID era.
Oh, man.
Yeah. But I say variants because I do believe that even though people have a home base that they're going to be most comfortable with, that it can and it does shift. If people change careers as they go through different eras of their life. In fact, the lifespan data is really interesting. Have not finished analyzing all of that yet. But if you take like 45 INTJs and look statistically over different age brackets, like how the brain wiring tends to shift, that's also a story.
Wow.
Yeah, you're saying across like the lifespan, you're saying it'll change?
Yes. So in the 15 to 25-year-old INTJs, there are a lot of We'd say that the strongest circuits, you look at the brain wiring, are in the left hemisphere. So this like analytical, normalizing intj. And then, as most types do in the 25 to 45 range, they diversify a lot, depending upon what careers they go into, what they do. In coaching INTJs over the years, knowing INTJ friends, I know we go into many different careers. And in fact, we tend to become more multidisciplinary, especially in the later years. So seeing people branch off into media, I mean, like the creation of media, for example, like film, music, writing, also, especially when they're younger, some athletic stuff, if they started that when they were young. So seeing that diversification really happen and become part of their career and their lives, not just a hobby, especially because INTJs tend to turn everything into something practical, in their minds, at least in our minds. And then there's, as with many types, again, post midlife, there is the brain wiring just becomes more sophisticated. In fact, it's like at the 45, probably, I mean, I look up to 55, but it's probably in real life more like 60. That's when the brain wiring is the most sophisticated and most organized. I mean, sophisticated in terms of whatever it is that the person does. Career-wise. And then after that, it really goes back to what often is underlying the brain wiring, which is the starburst pattern, because INTJs are dominant intuiting types. So that is often there in the background. And that really comes to the fore in the foreground for like across the board, regardless of what their career has been or whatnot. So I'm excited. It means that I'm in the most like sophisticated time in my life. Like I should take advantage of that. And that eventually I'll probably land back in that starburst pattern, although I spent a good 10 years in my 30s and early 40s there too. So so the brain wiring says. So yeah, that's the kind of results. And that's not done yet. We've only looked at about half the types.
Is there anything that you found truly like remarkable between like the ISFPs and INTJs? Because in your book, you said they're the closest type to INTJs, right? Would be.
I mean, in many ways, I feel like, of course, when people are young, so if they're reading about type, say when they're 18, and they're thinking, oh, my near opposite. And so the same for like ENFP and ESTJ. They're thinking like, really? Like, no, we seem to be very different. So for ENTJ, that would be ESFP. But I do believe as people get older, and Jung's work was primarily about midlife and afterward, that the functions tend to converge in terms of development. So for INTJ and ISFP, introverted intuiting, introverted feeling, some extroverted sensing for the INTJ, finally in 30s, 40s. I mean, I feel like my SE is still developing in ways that surprise me. Like I didn't know. Now I can close my eyes and go and completely experience like the taste of an orange or an apple and see it as if I'm actually seeing it, like what painters do or something. I didn't know. Like I never was able to do that before. Not saying that's ISFP per se, but extroverted sensing. And then for ISFPs, the extroverted thinking. And sometimes that will show up even earlier. So like the dominant subtype of ISFP usually has their extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking working in a businessy kind of way. And so I believe that there's always this pattern there. We want to talk about the pattern of the functions, not just like a linear development or something. And the pattern of the functions tends to be pretty close. I just think for younger people, it's a stretch. I understand that. But I'm saying as y'all get older that it becomes clearer and clearer.
Yeah, I've noticed like lately I don't know, I had a weird dream the other day, and I really think it was my introverted feeling coming out. And it's because I think I pretty much throw it away, lock it away. Because I just feel like whenever I use that function or I tend to delve into it, things don't go the way I want it to. But in the dream, it kind of let me know that everything that have pursued or want to pursue or have accomplished is rooted behind introverted feeling. If I actually take a deeper look at it. So it was kind of a weird dream. But I kind of was able to notice that was where it was rooted in, as an ENTJ, being able to say, introverted feeling is a huge part of my life, bigger than I've ever thought about, really. But I do feel like whenever I'm in introverted feeling too much, then things aren't working for me. There's just got to be something wrong with me for why I'm there. I don't like to be there for too long. But have you seen anything with the ENTJ data on the brain scans? Anything alarming?
So I don't unfortunately have it. I can call it up in a moment from the desktop. I mean, I would say it's really interesting, especially with younger ENTJs and ENFJ as well, that so left-brained, just so solidly left-brained. And I mean, everybody uses all of their brains, but I'm saying like that's something that really stands out. What you're describing in terms of the spine of the personality, as John Beebe calls it, or this tandem dynamics, as Linda Barron calls it, that really is there and present. And as you described it for ENTJs, often there is this internal feeling or desire that drives, say, their business aspirations out in the world. It's like, well, why are you doing this? And it might be largely unexamined, like, oh, I just want to make money. Like me, mine, I, myself kind of thing. But it can grow into something bigger, be more, and then also visionary in scope and have that motivation behind it. And certainly, for INTJs, it's then NISE. And something that drives me all the time is the desire to physically manifest what it is that I imagine. Like just having an idea of even just enjoying music or seeing imagining, oh yeah, like I could play around with something. Like, no, I want to actually learn how to play. Like I want to put something on iTunes. Like I want to push myself to physically do something. And in the way, to perform. And that is something that's there. And then as you said, if I get lazy or indulgent or something like that, then that's telling me actually I'm stressed out. And so I need to figure out, like in that sense, like maybe is Naomi Quank, who did Beside Ourselves, and did a lot of work on the shadow, early on, the psychologist Naomi Quank, that we can show up that fourth function in a very immature way. But I also believe, as you know from the Magic Diamond, we can incorporate it in synergistic ways that then is that like, yes, this is the path to manifest it. And I do meet, and I don't want to pass a judgment on it, that people find small ways and big ways to do it. So it's just because something is small or local in the person's life doesn't mean that that's like less worthwhile psychologically or something. That or more personalized one-to-one rather than one-to-many or that kind of thing. So let me actually look at this, the data for, did we get to ENTJ? Yes, we did get to ENTJ. I just didn't write it up yet. So I'm working with someone, a volunteer in the type community, who's like helping me go through all of this data and arrange it and everything. I don't remember really what stood out, but just like, it's so clear that there's this left hemisphere bias throughout life, and that the diversification seems to happen once a little bit in the 20s, and I see a bit more probably because of career variation, and a little bit after midlife, and then a return to the more left brain or also front brain, so dominant and normalizing styles in older age. So I do believe people return to the roots of their type when they get much older. hopefully wiser and more informed, a richer version of it, but not necessarily.
Yeah, I've noticed for myself as I've gotten older, I think I'm kind of growing into my extroverted intuition, my critic more, and it's made me a lot wiser and kind of let me be a lot more open minded. When I was younger, I was very like not open minded at all. Like it was one way to do it, it's this way, that's it. If you don't do it, you're lazy, like that type of thing. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that there's different circumstances for different people, and it's just like you gotta sit down and take your time and try to understand what's going on here. And that has happened to me as I've gotten older, and it just keeps getting, to me I feel like it keeps getting better. Like I'm able to make better decisions, I'm able to not be as impulsive, and I don't know if it's my parent or any critic that's coming in, but I kind of I'm seeing more possibilities, so I'm leaning into the critic more. But I've noticed like some people can indulge into their child function a lot. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think people just like loop back and forth? Because I've seen a lot of ENTJs that can go TESE all the time, and like it's almost like they're getting trapped. And I've noticed that like when people indulge in their child function too much, to a degree, it kind of messes up their life. You know, if I'm an ENTJ and I'm just using SE all the time, then I'm not implementing a vision for anything, I'm not really going anywhere. And I've noticed the same thing with, to a degree, INTJs that stay in FI. It's like it almost blocks the hero function. It's to me, it's kind of crazy.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say I am a fan of the looping or whatever we might call it, in the sense that, yeah, it's a phenomenon and it's there. I think a couple of things come to mind. One of them is I think it's very, going to John Beebe and how he talks about like narrative roles, that it goes a very something deep and archetypal. And an example would be in the show The Mandalorian, where you have the hero and then you have the child. And there's actually a lot of movies like The Last of Us, a TV show, like games, all of that, where you have a hero and a child. And it's a very appealing story. Like, we feel as an audience that even when the hero is rough and make mistakes and is gray and complex, that is wearing a mask, that we can trust this hero because the child says, I mean, basically to us as the audience, we can trust this person. And it's a very appealing story and an appealing place to be. It's not as interesting to watch the parent, because the parent parents, and that isn't as exciting. So I think dramatically it appeals to us, and it provides an anchor that can, when it's there a little bit, is really great. Like, it balances the hero, like in The Mandalorian, like he then becomes willing to change what he's doing to be more altruistic and to take off his mask, so to speak, and to soften up. But yeah, I mean, it's very appealing, and I see it a lot in people in their 20s, that the first and the third sort of get together and are just looping. And I think people are surprised to find, for example, that ENTJ and ENFJ as well, that with that child extroverted sensing can be very impulsive, and I would say have a lot of like adolescent distractions. And that's not part of the usual type descriptions, and yet it's there as a phenomenon. Now, to balance that, I would go to what Antonia Dodge says, as part of Personality Hacker, and Joel as well, that the number one advice that they give, the first advice with type, is work on your second function. And I think that that's great. And as people get a little bit older, I mean, even mid to late 20s, that balancing that second function with the sixth is really helpful. Mm-hmm. Because when I encounter INTJs who for some reason are only data driven, that they have a lot of choices are external, and they make sense and they're logical and they're efficient and so on. But I'm like, what are the principles behind those? And I don't mean like, what are your values? I mean the introverted thinking principles that are there. And when the person wakes up and discovers the power of the sixth function, when I realize like, oh, I don't have to like go and figure out an argument or explanation to every new thing that I encounter, there's this principle called living systems. That we're all living systems, and I can point to examples of those, whether those are trees or ant hills or whatever they are. Everything in the non-mechanical world, so basically that's not like a computer or circuit board or a clock or whatever it is, adheres to living systems principles. And therefore I instantly have like 10, 20 different answers or perspectives on that, whatever the question is, or even though it's completely new. Like, how empowering is that to have that doorway to open? Now, as for your specific case that you mentioned, I hear some of it is like having the meta perspective of like taking different viewpoints. And even the way you described it, like taking the time to sort of like sit down or step back and think about it, work through it. It sounds like a more introverted function. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the introverted intuiting is a part of that. And yet what can easily be a part of it is also the extroverted intuiting. And you know, sometimes with the ENTJs, it, like, you sort of got to push them to quote, waste time. Not in playful, fun, physical activity or whatever it is, sensuous kind of activity, but like metaphor and random thinking. So like putting an ENFP and an ENTJ into the same room or at the same table is great, because the ENFP is really going to be pushing in like 10 different directions and being like, yeah, let's just find out what we can explore. And the ENFP, and at some point the ENTJ early on to be like, wait, we spent 3 hours doing this and we don't seem to have arrived anywhere. But then other times the ENFP can be so brilliant and be just like boop, 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 and look at from over here, like this is what's going on with this person. Or what if you approach your business this way? Or what if you even named it this? So the same with the ENTP. ENTP and ENTJ, if they can find a way to work together, and be very synergistic. Same INTJ, INTP, if they find ways to work together. Yeah, they may create the atom bomb or a lot of other things, but I think that there's really synergy that way that can happen. Even INFP and INFJ, if they find ways to work together, that you know, INFJ can overdo some things, INFP can overdo other things, and they can balance each other out. So that's, I would say we don't even need to focus on how do we develop it in ourselves. Is the first step is just to make allowance for other people to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think patience is a big part of it, that just being patient to that other function. I mean, the times that I would listen to Linda describe the same principle again and again and again, I'm like, oh, I already know this. And she's repeating it to an audience or whatever it is. And yet I have to say years of being constantly re-exposed, now it like really sunk in. And that's really great. So yeah, introverted thinking for INTJs can seem a little bit academic or pedantic at times. But I do feel that it's very worthwhile, like the sixth function. And gave some advice. This is a few years ago pre-COVID, that an ENTJ at a university so he was like an editor of the student newspaper, and he would write like the, you know, editorial columns. And he very much approached it. One is he was unconscious of his own values and how much they were actually influencing what he was writing. Second of all, he saw the task as purely recruiting evidence in order to prove his argument, which is perfectly fine, except that I'm like, all of the arguments you bring forth are incoherent from like a PI point of view. Like, they all sound good at first blush, and then you read through them and you're like, this, if you were trying to build like something out of Legos, this thing is not going to hold together. Because I'm like, what principle underlies it? And he's thinking the whole time he's being very objective, and I'm like, dude, your values are so obvious. Right. The bias is so obvious, and if it's unconscious to you, I don't know if that's fourth function or eighth function. Is fourth function. But I'm like, wake up to it. And I told him, like, work on your FI and your TI. But he was too young to digest that. Like, he wasn't ready for that yet.
Yeah, I'm not even. I'm gonna be honest. Like when I was younger, I get in an argument with random people. I would always go to find the data to prove my point instead of looking at all of the data. But now that like I'm in a group full of like intjs and intps, I know way better than that now. It's like you better look at everything, and if you don't, they're gonna hit you real quick. Like, oh yeah. So like now I've learned to like you have to look at everything. You can't just like jump. Like that's why I said I have to take my time now. But back in the day, I just look at the information that I needed to prove my point, and that's it, and I throw it back out there. But you can't get away with that with INTJs. You can't get away with that with INTPs. You surely can't get away with that with ENTPs. If you're dealing with an ENTP, you better have like your data right, because they're gonna pick through whatever data you got and be like, "Yo, why did they do this study? Like why they do this study? This is a problem in this study. Like, did you think about that before you presented this argument? You just like, oh, I just gotta give up this. I just gotta give it up. But I've noticed that a lot with other ENTJs as well. They kind of make arguments and don't look at every aspect of it. Thomas, you want to say anything?
There's just that one question I wanted to ask Dario. Yeah, we have a friend of ours. He's in this INFP named Cody. Maybe someday we'll get him on camera. But he's asked this very good. I think it's a very good question. Something that I don't know the answer to, but maybe you do. But basically the question is there a connection between interaction styles and cognitive functions? Like, like for instance, if you look at the TE hero, TE inferior types, they're all outcome types. Types that have intuition and extroverted or introverted intuition in the hero, they're progression types. If it's in the parent, they're outcome types. And like you understand what I'm saying, how like depending where the functions are, like there's at the very least there's a correlation between placement of functions and interaction style. But is there any kind of brain scan data that shows this kind of connection, or is it something that just looks good on paper, but maybe there's not really a strong connection in the brain wiring?
Well, this is a great question, and it's something that maybe felt like it was settled 10 or 15 years ago in terms of temperament plus interaction style, 4 of each, then lead to 16 types. And now I think the truth is out that it's a little bit more complicated. I still find interaction styles quite useful as long as I don't try and get too much in the weeds with them. So I am just prefacing it with that.
Okay.
I believe that looking at the whole pattern can help. So like, let's take ESFJ and ENFJ. So in interaction styles, the ENFJ is directing, and ESFP is informing. But otherwise, I mean, they have the same dominant extroverted feeling. So we would think, okay, shouldn't they be fairly similar? Now we could then look at the third function and say, well, the ENFJ has introverted intuition, which tends to very much come up with the idea and have this kind of focus to it. There's a reason why all of the NJ types are directing types. Whereas ESFJ has extroverted intuiting, which is, I mean, it can show up in various ways. It can show up as a sense of humor. It can show up as fears of the future. I mean, it's for both, they both have their issues, but for ENFJ, intuition is second, and for ESFJ, it's third. And it could be that the extroverted intuition softens the extroverted feeling and makes it more playful and indirect. And so if we have to like draw a line somewhere between directing and forming, we'll say the ENFJ falls on the directing side and the ESFJ falls on the informing side because of how their intuition is, even though that's not their dominant function. So there is that. I think Linda would probably say, well, interaction styles is looking at something different fundamentally. So the cognitive processes or mental functions or cognitive functions, there's different words used to describe them, that those are cognitive in nature, essentially. Now, Jung said that they were forms of consciousness, but let's just say, like, if you go into psychology, they have different topics like motivation, perception, affect, cognition. Like, they have these different categories of things that we can study. And Linda would say, well, temperament is about motivation, which is why she now calls temperament essential motivators. And motivation in a deep sense, like what is it that deeply psychologically motivates you? And the interaction styles is about affect. And then the functions are about cognition. So they're like fundamentally like different categories. So we shouldn't try and like smush them together into one thing. Is there like, in physics, there's this idea of symmetry. So you can have the particle description of things and the wave description of things, and you can't smash them down into one model, but they can work together side by side. And so I think that she wouldn't use the physics example, but that's one way to look at it. It's like, let's be careful even in questioning how we're asking the question. In terms of the brain data, what I see with these four subtypes is, and the same Victor Golenko looked at DISC, which is what grew out of social styles, which was also the origin of interaction styles. And he's like, the four subtypes and the DISC social styles, like they align with each other. So then that would say interaction styles is like completely its own animal. It's its own thing. My answer, in terms of what I see the difference in the brain, so let's say enfj and isfj. I mean, they for sure show up as different in terms of typical brain wiring, especially the stuff that's going on in sort of the mid-level, secondary kind of stuff. ENFJs tend to be more left brain, generally, regardless of what the other patterns are present there. ESFJs tend to be more right brain, whatever, regardless of the patterns that are there. Both of them tend to have the zigzag, like cross-hemisphere stuff that feels typical of extroverted feeling. And it's the same, like ENTP and ENTJ. Like, both of them, you could have two dominant versions of each, which look like in charge. But the ENTJ is still going to be like more brain wiring towards the front and the left. ENTP is more brain wiring towards the front and the right, and more likely to also have some kind of background starburst pattern. So I do see these as like statistical tendencies within the type. And so my answer is that there is, I don't know what to call them exactly, it's like an overarching generic term, but there's interaction style in a very deep sense that's part of the type pattern. That in a way, all ENFJs, relative to say ENFPs, are directing. And ENFJs may not even notice this until you sit them down next to an ENFP. And the ENFP is like, why are you so directing? You're weird. And the ENFJ is like, why are you so scattered? And why don't you just say what you want to say? Mm-hmm. So relative to the other types, but then when we go within the type and we look at development, that there's like a developmental version of interaction styles that then varies based upon, it's like the expression of your type that seems to vary with your career and the size of the organization and your cultural background, gender, age. I imagine even the relationships that people have been in for long periods of time, that's going to influence them. So for me, as INTJ, inherently as an INTJ, I'm chart the course in some way that's very different than, say, INTP. But relative to other INTJs, I'm a get things going INTJ. I'm just like, let's bring energy to the room and talk to people. Like, I'm not one of those like, oh no, like I hide away from people. I'm like highly sensitive or introverted or something like that. No, I mean, I need to manage my energy, but that's it. Like, otherwise I love to travel and I'm excited and interested and all of that until the battery, when it reaches like 1%, and then it's like, you need to shut down. Yeah. And I know many INTJs, like we seem we can go socially for a while, and then all of a sudden, in like 1 minute, the psyche is like, now you need to leave, or shut down, or like recharge, whatever it is. And it could be that, in fact, like with Helen Fisher's work, that it's hormones that are behind it. So relative to other INTJs, I have more dopamine, or I'm more sensitive to dopamine stimulating activities, however we want to try and like massage that wording. So does that make sense, that there's like a part that's like relative to other types that's inherent to our type, and then when we look within our type, we see variation that can help explain like why are some INFJs, for example, like really chill, and other INFJs are like super sticklers. And I think, it's really boring to just go to the trait level and say, well, one of them are more J and more P on the scale, like a little bit J versus a lot J. I mean, we can say that. That's a model too. The preferences are also a parallel model. But I think it's more interesting to say that, both of them are chart the course, but in very different ways, at different levels, which explains why you can have an INFJ who's running a business and is chart the course at a very high level. You have an INFJ who's a therapist who sees people one-on-one and is chart the course in the moment, or maybe about how they learn how to do therapy methods. And then like INFJ and INTJs will do, when we know we need to get into a situation, we just sort of go into like, we prepare and then sort of get into a trance state, and then we go up on stage, even if that's just a therapy room with another person, and we like let it work itself out, like the NI is doing its thing. I think that there are these two levels within the individual, like within the type, and then the type relative to others. And I think that that's what leads to confusion. And a friend of mine, INTJ, was just saying, who has like a lot of, he's Israeli, but has spent time in China and has a lot of exposure to Chinese culture and martial arts and so on. He's like, I really envisioned years ago, he's like, I just knew like at some point type was going to go from 16 to 64, which is the I Ching pattern is 64. Mm-hmm. And he's like, because, and other people then in the past few years, I mean, I have to give them credit, people are pushing me. They're like, aren't there more than 16? Like, we need more, we can have more specificity. And I think it really has been eye-opening, because as I start to get into it, especially for the SJ types, I'm like, wow, yes, there are creative version of SJs. Like, my grandmother was the creative ESTJ, and there's no question ESTJ preferences, but also different than, like, say, a military ESTJ or something like that. Like, what was going on? Like, what was different? That there are creative ISTJs, and they learn to express their type in a different way than normalizing or dominant or harmonizing, which align very well with the interaction styles. So I know this is asking a lot for asking people to hold two versions of the same thing in mind. The relative to the person, the type INFJs directing compared to INFPs, but within themselves, there are also these same variations.
Yeah, well, I figured it'd be a really complicated answer, to that question. But I guess, well, one of the things I had in mind though is like, and I don't know exactly what the brain scan data shows on this, but like how, let's say like how introverted intuition, just how it functions differently in the hero spot versus in the parent slot, or same thing with like extroverted thinking or any of the other functions, like how they function differently depending on where they're located in the stack.
Let's talk about that. Like I'm happy to. I saw that since the beginning. So one thing is that a function can show up a couple of ways. One is that we have all these different functional regions, and they usually are operating in concert with each other, but we're also aware from brain lesions and that kind of thing, like, you knock out like the speech center or centers, that, there are these functional regions. So it could be that when we look at any one of any type, but let's say we're going to talk about ENTJ and INTJ, that there could be one or two functional regions that are the workhorses for introverted intuiting. This part about, we have a timeline and we can visualize our own timeline and walk ahead in the future. And that's a part of our brain that helps us do that. And that could be that specific thing. Introverted intuition can also show up as a network of things or as just a whole brain like flow pattern. So it's like, what does it take for entj or intj to get into a state of flow? So there's not even just one answer to how the function manifests. But just like holding that in mind and saying that. Now, the example that hit me the most early on was with introverted feeling. And so we'll use the infp as a starting example. So there are most people, when they listen to someone talking, their head goes away and they're thinking about a response, or they're thinking about what the person is saying, but they're not like 100% attentive. Mm-hmm. INFPs can be super attentive to the sense that like they're just going to go into this relaxed delta waves, but very high amplitude delta waves. So it's not like the sleeping delta waves. It's like they're present and they're listening and the brain is very active. Not with a bunch of activity in it, but like as I say, like there are lots of gentle waves, but they're big gentle waves. They're in this state of flow of listening. I have watched an INFP stay in that mode. Most people can do it from a few seconds to maybe a minute. No, this INFP made a conscious choice to listen, and this was a laboratory thing set up with somebody else. For 10 solid minutes, he stayed in the state of flow listening. And it was around a top. So we paired people. This was a year that we paired people around hot political topics. And this one was about gun control. The ENFP had his perspectives about it. And conveniently, his fraternity brother, who was also in the lab, whose ESTJ preferences, had a different perspective, like the opposite. And the INFP was intrigued because he said, we've never had this conversation, like, let's do it. And he listened to the ESTJ give his argument for his reasons for like 10 minutes. And then towards the end of the 10 minutes, like I could see the pattern start to break up. And then the INFP was done listening. And needless to say, the ESTJ did not sway him in any way, but I got to give credit for the INFP for really going to that state of flow where it wasn't in the brain activity. It's not like some part of his brain is like thinking of a counter argument or imagining something else or whatever. Like every part of the brain was involved. And I think this is so important, especially for the FJ people, to understand listening is not about processing the word content in order to fill an agenda. For introverted feeling types, if you want to understand the introverted feeling types in your life, understand listening to them means you listen with your whole self. And he was very open and sort of, vulnerable in that listening state, like just saying, I'm going to do all of this. Now, when we go, so that's in like the hero role. And for ISFP, it appears differently because ISFPs have extroverted sensing. So what I would see with the ISFPs, when one in particular experience comes to mind, when he was supposed to listen to the different voices in the group and then figure out like a compromise, he would go into this listening mode and then he would stand up and take an action. And then he would go back to the listening mode. And then he would sit down and do something else, like physical, and then would go back to listen. There was a back and forth that was happening all the time that was mixed in with physical action. But let's talk about like auxiliary mode then, the auxiliary role. So there was an ESFP, and the ESFP was really interesting. He would go into this flow state, the same thing, like delta waves, but very high amplitude. And then that isn't the only kind of flow state, but I'm just talking about one that really stands out and seems very type related. And I couldn't figure out at first what was causing this, because sometimes it would just come up in the lab. And this is at a time when they were with me for 10 weeks. And while each student usually only went once, we would go for at least 2 hours. and do a variety of things. And finally, we figured it out, that he would go into this flow state whenever a gal in the room was speaking. And if it was a guy who was speaking, he wasn't in the flow state.
Interesting.
And finally we did, because it wasn't like he's not even seeing this. It's just like, because the students would play different roles. Sometimes he would be a technician, sometimes he'd be a Confederate, sometimes he would sit next to me and like learn how to interpret the data. And so we had a hypothesis, and so we were able to test it and see it working, that when she would speak all of a sudden. And of course, I don't remember, I would have to go back and look to see like who exactly was in the lab. I know there was more than one gal, I don't remember. But he said the moment we brought this up, like debriefing at the end, he's like, oh no, this makes so much sense now. He says, I thought like it didn't make sense at all, but it does, because he says all the time in my fraternity, they always say, like, they say, you don't listen. They say to him, you don't listen, you don't listen. And he's like, I don't understand, because I have all these female friends. Like, he has no problem finding dates and all that. And he's like, they always tell me, like girlfriends, female friends, they're like, you're such a good listener. So he listens like half the time, literally to like half the population, but not the other half. And so it's this reduced scope. And then going to, we'll just go ahead to the fourth function for introverted feeling. This was the same ESTJ, but now is before with the INFP, but now it was his turn like a few weeks later. And he would go into this state of flow, but only when I spoke. Not like I'm just giving you instructions or something, but when he would ask me a question, like, and he's wants to know what the answer is. And for an ESTJ to actually stop and listen to you, like for anybody out there, like who knows type, like that's a very special moment for the ESTJ to be actually listening. And I knew from my grandmother, like what it takes, because for her, basically, you know, I learned as a teenager, if I wanted to convince my grandmother of something, I had to start with the phrase, the Pope said. And if she really didn't believe it, then she's like, wait, where did the Pope say this? Like, did you read this? Like, where is this written down? If she really didn't believe it. But for the most part, that was a convincer, because it wasn't just that they're an authority figure. It's that they're also, there's respect for that person. And I think that's really important, because when we talk about SJs, often it just gets reduced as like, oh, they listen like mindless sheep to authority figures. No, like respect is a big part of it. Trust is a big part of it. They don't listen to just everybody. They may give people the benefit of the doubt who are in authority, but the respect has to be there, which explains why ESTJs can also be rebellious, little devils, assholes to people they don't respect, including authority figures, if they don't respect them. So there was this very small window, not half the population, but like 1% of the population, maybe. I'm just making that number up, like as an example of something's very small number, that would get the ESTJ into this flow listening mode. And so I believe that when we talk about what role, the actual manifestation, where it is in the stack, is of course going to vary from one person to the next somewhat. But I would say when the function is dominant, it's pretty much, it covers anything, anytime, anywhere, you know, in the universe, everywhere, all at once. Like that's great. As we go down in the stack, there are fewer and fewer occasions where the person either feels competent to do that or it just happens spontaneously. For whatever reason, probably half-conscious and even unconscious reasons. Like, why does the ESFP only listen that way to women and not to men? Is it going to get him in trouble later in life? Like, and sometimes people figure out strategies. I knew ENTP in the lab who also knew he had difficulty in a similar kind of thing. And he said he learned when he needed to to talk with men and listen to them as if he were listening to a potential date. And he had to trick his mind into like actually get him to listen. Because he's like, yeah, there's this girl I'm really interested in. I don't want her to go on a date with me or whatever. Like, I really do give attention. It's like, then I realize like, oh, I'm capable of that, giving that attention. Like, where else can I use that if I really need to? So kudos to the ENTP to figure that out. So I think that's one important way. I think that the other thing is this really tricky word called conscious, and conversely unconscious. So if I were an INTP, I would be really skeptical about these words that are used with respect to type. What does it mean that the dominant function is more conscious? Like, if the person goes into this flow state in delta waves, albeit very high amplitude delta waves, but delta waves are automatically associated with stuff that's like deeply rooted and programmed within us. That's like, in theta waves even more so. It's like the stuff that is just like automatic, we know how to do. If stuff is automatic and we know how to do, then we're not really thinking about it. We have unconscious competence, as in the sense of being out of awareness. Like the ENTJ doesn't stand around like thinking, like in the moment with business partners, like, oh no, like, how do I do business? Like they've already mastered that. So it's an unconscious competence. So when we throw around this word, like the higher in the stack, the more conscious they are, I don't know what that means. Like that means several different things. Maybe it's more available to the person, more mature, more integrated. Those might be better words than saying that they're more conscious. And then it actually feels like the second and third functions are the ones that are more in conscious awareness. The second function in the sense that like, not that we ruminate about how to do it, but like, oh, I can make a conscious choice to start doing extroverted thinking and to stop doing it. With the third function, more often it's the inverse case. I feel like I'm caught up inside the third function. I don't know how to stop it, or maybe call it on command. Like I have to figure out how to get into that space. So I think that we can, so Walter Lowen in the 1980s broke down each of the functions into 3 modes: starting, processing, and stopping. Or really the stopping is also about like evaluating the results. So you know, like, oh, should I stop now? Should I stop later? Should I make an adjustment? It's more like, how do we know we're being effective with the function that we're using? How do we know where it's appropriate to use it? And then how do we know how to do it? And I think that even functions higher in the stack, like our second function, as an INTJ, I don't think about how to do extroverted thinking. It just happens. Like, oh, don't you know how to like to do a to-do list? Like in that most like obvious like example. Or somebody presents an idea, like, don't you know how to break that into like several structural parts and like organize the idea? No, like people can't do that. Like, or I think the most shocking to think about the whole pattern, ESFJ, in a leadership position, cannot foresee consequences, except in like a social sense of like, oh, if I talk to so-and-so and say a rude thing, they won't like that. In a business sense of like, oh, if I do this, can I foresee, introverted, intuiting, the practical consequences, like, will this be effective or not? On the ground level, like extroverted thinking, like that's like completely outside of their experience, to the point where they may believe that's not even possible. So the only thing we can do is talk to people and have good intentions. And I'm like, no, we can actually look ahead into the future and see that some ideas are smarter, dumber than others. Like, can't you do that? But no, the answer is no. So the functions, even though we might talk about them playing different roles and say like things about competence and we can like improve our competency in different functions, I think sometimes we need to step back and realize like how very different every type is from the others. And that's just, and that's cool. That keeps type being more than just like, we're all the same except for a few little differences. Like, no, the type differences are real and they're big.
You know that thing you just said. I have an ESFJ coworker, and like her life just seems to not have went the way that she wanted it to go, and it's painfully obvious for me to see it. Like, and I'm like, why didn't you do this, and she just doesn't understand it. It's like when it comes to like future planning or anything, it's just not there, and that's the reason why her life is in the position that it's in. And I'm just trying to understand, like, like, why does this happen? Like, why does this happen? Like, this is like painfully obvious to me to see, but like you said, she has introverted intuition trickster, so it's a complete blind spot, and like all of her, her troubles come from that. And I've kind of noticed that in itself. Me and Thomas were talking about like how much the trickster actually affects your life, and what I've noticed, it really affects you a lot more than you think. Like for some of the, what we've noticed, because we got like a lot of intjs and whatnot, they can be so into introverted feeling that they don't even care about how you feel. They're completely unaware of how you feel at all, and it's not even like part of a solution. Like I've seen like intjs that will literally think they've never done anything wrong, and it's like counterproductive to them as a person. But I've also seen the same thing with entjs. Like you can't just brush through everything. You can't just rush through ramp. Like you can't just bulldoze everything. And like I told Thomas, I feel like it just blows up your life. If you can't get a hold of that child function, it will literally blow up your life. You're going nowhere very fast. And you just kind of pretty much talked about that in a sense. But Dario, I want to ask you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. It's and for the 7th and 8th function, I'll just briefly say what motivated me to think about it a bit is now that my parents' generation is in their 70s, and even though my dad will be 80 in a few days, 81 in a few days, that I can see that usually their deficits and problems, especially towards the end of their life, are the consequence of neglecting their 7th and 8th functions. And I don't believe it's productive to try and like think differently in the sense of being like, oh, for INTJ, like do more extroverted feeling. Because when I really think about extroverted feeling, then that's like placing the locus of my values and feelings outside of myself. And then that would be really self-defeating. I mean, the extroverted thinking would be like, what you doing? Like, you're an independent thinker. Like, you're letting other people think for you. Like, why would you do that? But it's still like doing something in our lives to cover the bases and to at least have awareness to like soften up a little bit or to ask for help in something. And our culture, so it also, what you're saying applies with respect to a cultural or societal reference point, that our society is built around introverted sensing and extroverted thinking to a large part. Especially, I think more in the past decade or two, there's more extroverted feeling that has entered the business domain, for example. But for anybody who has those two functions, they can often get away with, like INTJs can get to the end of their life and there's, like all their ducks are in a row, like financially, they have a place to live and food to eat and they can travel and this and that, but like, are they happy or are they lonely? And so then the extroverted feeling sort of came back to bite them in a very long-term kind of way. If they were never able to adapt to, the other person, your partner, or say you were married for a number of years and then got a divorce, and it's like, because your partner is like, you don't pay attention to me. Mm-hmm. Like INTJ can be very much work first. So it's not like the ESFJ who's like, how do we do things together? And so I think that there also the challenges are with respect to something like a cultural standards too. So some types will have more of a challenge than others because their preferred functions are like don't match anything that the culture naturally rewards. Mm-hmm. And then to what you said about getting that third function under control, yeah, that's so true. And so part of the upcoming book, which is what we started out with, is, it is for the most part talking about subtypes, but I will be talking about two other things. And one of them is energy management. And the other one is what I call the neurotic boundary. And the neurotic boundary goes very much back to Jung. And Jung's focus in seeing his clients, and he described as a general term, like many different kinds of neuroticism. What he meant by the neurotic boundary is, like we've been talking about, like conscious and unconscious, or like what role something has in the stack. I would say we can also think of it as like there's the ego and there's the unconscious, and then there's a boundary space in between. Like a beach is a boundary between the ocean and the land. Mm-hmm. And ecologically in nature, the boundary points between places are often the richest and most interesting. Like multiple times as I've traveled to look at the boundaries between wild space and farmland, the most interesting, richest spaces are immediately outside the farmland on the boundary between it and the wild space. And I believe that's true of the psyche as well, that our most interesting and turbulent part of our personality is the boundary space. And that is like probably 80% like the third function. And then the rest of it, there can be also fourth function and some other things that are in there. So that's always going to be a part of us. Like as ENTJ, extroverted sensing is always going to be that child, and it's always going to be in that neurotic boundary space where there are benefits and wonderful things, but there's also a lot of stuff that seems to undermine everything else. And you're wondering, like, how can I resolve those? You can keep working on it, but I believe that fundamentally the neurotic boundary is there as like a permanent fixture. Mm-hmm. And it is also the source of the impetus, and I say the impetus for growth and creativity. So for INTJs, the neurotic boundary, which can show up as things like sudden outburst of anger at hypocrisy, or being very black and white in terms of moral judgment, or having extreme loyalty. On the one hand, like, oh, I'm comfortable with emotions as long as they're positive. And then to dig into the negative emotions is something that happens every so often, but is otherwise pushed away. And then when it does come out, is childlike. Not 2-year-old, but is childlike. Those are permanent fixtures in the personality, and we can work on ways to manage them. Like I learned from taking an acting prep workshop week after week after week, where INFJ is running the class. I can't get up on stage and be carrying with me unconscious emotions from the rest of my day, because they will immediately show up in the scene, whether I want them to or not. And so I had to learn starting on my drive over there, stepping through the door, waiting for 10 minutes to just keep focusing on, like, how do I feel? How do I really feel? How do I really feel, like, underneath even that? So sometimes the answer is to go deeper into the third function in like a genuine way that the INFP will, like, of course I'm like peeling away the layers of my emotions all the time. Mm-hmm. And it has nothing to do with how anybody else feels. It's just like peeling away and like the honesty of sitting with my own emotions. Like, oh, I'm angry about, no, I'm annoyed. Why am I annoyed? There's something that's angering me. So I'm annoyed in the moment, but there's something long-term that's angering me. And then below that, I'm sort of depressed. And then below that, I feel injured by something. And then below that, so this sort of gives the idea. I haven't thought a lot about what that experience is like for extroverted sensing, because that's not the majority of my neurotic boundary for my type. Mm-hmm. But I know what it looks like for ENTJ and ENFJ. So this will also be something I think is really helpful, both for people to forgive themselves and to understand like what a huge part the third function plays in their lives, and what that looks like, and to know that it's almost like the angel that they have to keep wrestling with.
I told Thomas, I told him I'm gonna locking up my lock up the child. That was my plan of action for like the child function. Just lock it up. Like your life would be so much better if you just lock it up. But you know, that's a kind of an ENTJ approach to things, like kind of like one sided, not seeing the whole side of things. But yeah, I want to ask on IQ. How does IQ play with the ability to use a function? Because I've noticed, like per se, like let's say someone who has like someone like Ray Dalio, if you know who Bridgewater, he has extroverted thinking, and it's pretty strong, right? Mm-hmm. How does that influence him versus somebody who, let's say, with a lower IQ using extroverted thinking? Does that like play a big part, or is it?
Yeah, so there's I don't have a definitive question to that, and I haven't like turned myself to thinking about it. What I can say is that there is quite a bit of data, especially from the 1960s through 1980s, on IQ and MBTI results that show a pretty clear curve with the dominant intuiting types and intuiting types in general scoring higher IQ than sensing, and then those who have especially sensing feeling. So, and I think that's not a surprise because IQ tests were probably designed by people with thinking preference and intuiting preference. So there's an element of that.
Yeah.
Just want to like get that out of the way.
That's true.
Yeah. And then have I met smarter and dumber versions of my type? Yes. And I know I'm not the smartest version of my type. Like, because I have some days that are smarter than others. So right there, I'm like, there's a dumb version of me too. That just does stupid shit. Like I wasn't thinking about it, or I was being too hasty, or like whatever it was. Now, there is this riff in psychology, academic psychology, where most psychologists sit on the side of like what's called G, or general intelligence. That this is like, there's an overarching intelligence quotient that's like this fluid intelligence. It's the ability to solve novel problems in a smart way that come along. Then there are another group of people who don't necessarily dismiss that, but emphasize that there are multiple kinds of intelligence. So that's like Howard Gardner. And that people can have strengths or weaknesses within those. So just being good at visual spatial intelligence is not necessarily the only marker or the thing that can point to general intelligence. I see the value in both. I do believe that there is a concept of like general intelligence, just as there is a concept of maturity in general. Where I think we can go down like a little road to add to this question is the work by Roger Pearman. And Roger has a lot of data over decades, mostly from corporate America, but also the military. So getting a lot of STJs in particular. And he said it's so interesting that when you give people multiple assessments, so the MBTI or equivalent was one of them. He also would do like the 360 evaluations and get those back. So for those of you who don't know, like 360, I mean, you guys know what 360 eval is, right? Like where your coworkers rate you. And then also there are some scales on like leadership maturity. I'm not familiar with those, but I know he used that as well. And what he found consistently across the types is that there were 3 versions of every type in terms of maturity. And that the low maturity ISTJ is the one that basically is rigid black and white, third function, introverted feeling, rigid introverted sensing. Like this is the way it's always been. It has to be this way. Almost like OCD version of extroverted thinking. Every duck needs to be perfectly aligned in its place. And then there's like to the point where the person is disliked and dysfunctional and doesn't last in their leadership position long or managerial position. And then there's the like standard ISTJ that we read about in type descriptions that are trying to be friendly and fair to everybody. And then there's like the super ISTJ, who has incorporated extroverted intuiting and a mature version of introverted feeling, and is even aware of the need, whether they know type language or not, for extroverted feeling. And this person, so some of it, the way he explained is, it seems like there's an incorporation of the less preferred functions into the psyche. And then that creates a more flexible or fluid person. And then that gives the feeling of more intelligence, because the person can, in fact, they have more resources to draw upon and are more willing to draw upon those. And so we could approach like a type version of IQ, which is about maturity and flexibility and openness to our own psychological resources, as well as perspective shifting to other people. And then it becomes like there's every type has the capacity to do that or not. Like I've met, in fact, sometimes at my point, like I used to think like ESFPs were so stupid, especially male ESFPs, like the things that they would get excited about. I'm like, dude, you were just like, it's different colors, like who cares? Now I have more appreciation for ESFPs, for sure. But I still am reminded when I meet young ESFPs, I'm like, no, they actually are dumb, some of them. Like, that is a thing. And the same, like I've met in academia, I've met some INTJs who are just like really rigid. And not necessarily by age, it's because it is my type, and I feel like I give a lot of benefit to the doubt to other INTJs. I'm like, no, this INTJ is really rigid. Or my favorite, when they think they're being objective and talking about something, and I'm like, oh, your values are so obvious. And it just like, conversely, INTJs are really can notice well when someone else is being illogical, but we don't necessarily notice when we ourselves are being biased. It takes an INTP to come along and like point out the flaws, or ENTP. I prefer ENTP because ENTP is more fun about it. And so there is this, I think we could define IQ in a psychological way, as opposed to the IQ test, which primarily is, I feel like, is skill-based and is just pointing to like brain resources that are primarily around language, abstract use of language, and mental rotation problems and that kind of thing, which are also skills. Like they're legit skills, but the IQ tests also miss out on a lot of things. And as Howard Gardner says, he says the ultimate measure is survival. So it could be that people are, quote, dumb, and rigid, but have a lot of kids, and those kids go on to succeed, that actually they were smart in an evolutionary sense.
Never thought about that way.
Yeah, and there are like, I've never met the Kardashians, so I'm not going to comment on them. But the fact is, the meme is very successful. Everybody knows who I'm talking about. They have lots of money. They're enjoying life. They're going to pass this on to their descendants. And so in this really sort of like harsh biological scientific way, like there are people who get memes out and they're like the worst memes, like terrible, like memes that don't work. And yet the whole society might adopt those memes. And then like 80 years later, like with communism, they're like, oh, what were we thinking? I'm like, I don't know. I don't think you were thinking at all. Like not looking at the consequences, or just naivete or whatever it is. I want to finish this answer with something that I find really scary but makes a lot of sense. And I could talk about the chat GPT as well, but we won't get into that with this answer. No, because I worked in AI for a while and I appreciate what it can and cannot do and what the meaning of what it is. But it's this. So studies of IQ, there are studies like academic studies on IQ, large populations that are longitudinal over time. And they look at both fluid and crystallized intelligence. So crystallized intelligence is like the stuff that you know down pat because of your career and growing up, like how to ride a bicycle, and that a medical doctor just remembers certain things because they did it for 40 years. And then, so that's crystallized intelligence. And then the general intelligence or fluid intelligence is this capacity to face and understand, successfully solve novel problems. What's interesting is you look at how those two measures of intelligence change by age, is that crystallized intelligence tends to remain the same, pretty much, like increases in our 20s and 30s and 40s. And when it does decrease, it's only till the 70s. And then maybe in the 80s, yes, it's going to drop off. If the person, especially if they have dementia or something, then that essentially sabotages the underlying wiring that supports it. But what's scary and amazing is that the fluid intelligence begins dropping off in the 60s. And by the time the person has reached 80 years old, their fluid IQ is 30 points lower on average than it was earlier in life. Oh, wow. That when it comes to novel problems, the average person at age 75 or 80 is literally 30 IQ points stupider than when they were in their 20s and 30s. That's like terrifying to think about. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of scary, because I watched the interview the other day with Bobby Fischer, and he was like the chess champion, and when he got older, he kind of became like a kind of wacko jackal to a degree. But when he was like in his 20s or whatnot, he was pretty he was on point. And the same could be said of like Donald Trump. If you watch him when he was younger, he's a very well-spoken person, and now you get him now, and it's kind of like, you can kind of see with that drop off what you're talking about.
I will let people know about this. Yes, I agree with you, and I've seen that. And when we did brain imaging on people, and I guess it was 2016, watching clips of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And based on that, by the way, I placed a bet that Donald Trump would win based on the brain imaging results of people watching them. Because his own Hillary Clinton's own self-declared supporters, like, their brains were not excited by her. Whereas his people, like, they were excited. So we showed clips, and when he talks to the general public, it's like an eighth grade, not like fourth grader, like 12 years old, something like that. But there are clips of him talking to think tanks, for example. He is able to talk at a higher level. And so that was somewhat reassuring to me. I remember watching those. I'm like, okay, so when he does need to step up his reading level, his speaking level, he can do that. So that was a little bit reassuring. But yes, in general, that happens. And I've even noticed this as like working in Norway, and I keep having to write stuff that is always going to be for people with the second or third language from around the world. And I have to dumb down everything I say. I have to forget my original early British education and only use the simplest words that people are going to get, basically like eighth grade reading level. And I noticed after a year of doing that, I'm like, I speak all the time. And in fact, I'm living in a foreign country. To people who are graciously speaking English to me, I should dumb down my language a little bit. I don't need to use SAT words. And now that's infected everything I do. Like, I really, like, there are times it's like, I need to go back. So last year I spent a month in Scotland, which was really wonderful. I'm like, I need to go back to the UK and hang out with smart British people just to regain my verbal IQ. And that's, and I lost the humor part of it many years ago, but I like to at least get the vocabulary back. So I think that there are things we can do. And then there's stuff like LSD, other psychedelics, which actually shake up the brain wiring. Because as you described, people fall into paranoid traps or various kinds of traps, depressive traps, whatever their neurosis is as they get older. And the brain crystallizes and shrinks whatever around that like circular thinking is, and then they become trapped in that. And I have some hope that as the use of psychedelics become more common, that will be seen as a therapy to help people break out of the traps of, I want to say older age, but honestly, I mean people who are even after 35, they're already sort of crystallized. They think, I'm successful on Wall Street. I don't need to think any differently. And they don't. I work for the New York Times. I'm like very smart. I've succeeded. So they don't need to think differently. And they don't. Like Linda Barron said, the push to mature is very small, is a small voice inside of us. And then the world can give us a lot of feedback that says, no, you're doing great.
Yeah, that's a big thing. I've noticed. Well, I've read all of Robert Greene books, but he talks about that. Like that becomes a lot of people's problems. Is you find a formula that works, and you keep going back to that formula. You keep going back to that formula, but that ends up being your downfall later on because you just keep going back to that formula. And sometimes you just got lucky, or sometimes like at some point you're gonna have to grow from that formula. And like he has like a whole bunch of like generals in like history, that lost wars because they just kept recycling the same thing that they got success with. I think Napoleon defeated one of the guys pretty easy that they thought that they were going to crush Napoleon, but they were recycling something that was 100 years behind, while Napoleon was on the cutting edge of like warfare. So, I've noticed that it doesn't matter who the person is. Once they get a formula and it works, they keep repeating it, especially if they're systematic, especially if they're like an ENTJ, INTJ, ISTJ, ESTJ. They're going to recycle that formula because it worked for them. And it's kind of hard to say no.
And for the feeling types, it is recycling the narrative, the story that they tell themselves and other people, that I'm this kind of person and I went through that in life and this tells me this about myself and others. And so there's a story and a feeling that goes with the story, and they just hang on to that story no matter what. And that's that can also be very much the person's downfall, as well as the ripple effect of affecting other people. Yeah.
Wow. I'm very interested in this book. When does it come out, Dario?
Well, all the descriptions are written and have been out there for a year, and it's actually been really good to get feedback from people. Like one of the infj subtypes, there was an infj who was like, you could do a little bit better wording on one of, just for the name of the subtype even. I'm like, that's cool. So it's been good to continue to get feedback. No, I mean, it's like, especially infjs and wording, like that's like a tricky area, as Linda and I discovered many years ago. But taking in that feedback and getting a sense of it, that's been good. I do need to finish the bookends of it, and sort of at the last minute, I had originally thought of a book on energy management. Mm-hmm. And then I'd like to have so many things on my to-do list. I just need to take what I have on neurotic boundary and energy management and fold that into this book. And as part of that, then there was the lifespan data. And it's like analyzing the rest of that data is sort of what's holding me up. So when? That's tough for me to know, because when I go back to Norway in like 10 days, like they have purchased 100% of my time, and that really is 100% of my time, because otherwise I need to spend it doing my extroverted sensing, introverted feeling stuff, or I just get totally like thrown out of the loop. And I love the gym that I found there in Oslo, like great gym. Very, very happy with it. Rowing machines too. But I do know there are some conferences coming up, and I often use those as deadlines to push myself to finish something. So if I don't make it by the British type conference, which is in April, I'm very motivated for Personality Hackers live event, which will be in Pittsburgh at the end of May, and I will be there for the whole week for that, doing some workshops. And while the week, like their live event is closed, because those are students that are completing a training, the last day and the evening before that, so like Saturday night through Sunday, are open. I mean, people can come and attend those who are interested in type. So I am like very motivated to set that. And then there's the in-person British type conference in June. So that's another deadline. So I got those 3 deadlines to think about. I'm hoping, I don't know, I'm torn, because the extroverted thinking part of me is like, I want to keep working full time for my client, because the pay is just beautiful. Like, is just, I see those dollar signs marching into my savings account, and I'm like, oh yeah. And I love the work. Like, it's great work. Especially because I have 2 SJs that I'm working with who handle a lot of the detailed stuff. So that's wonderful.
Beautiful.
But on the other hand, I need my own time. And so I don't know when that's going to happen. And I accidentally started writing, and I'm like 80% done with the temperament and interaction styles book.
Oh, wow.
Nice.
Well, we definitely want that.
Happened. Yeah, just because there's this, it's not quite out yet. So there's a website called Type School that has various folks. I think that the landing page is already there. This is not me. It's typeschool.co. And learn typology, meet your people, master your life. So these people, basically it's like Udemy or Teachable, except that it's the entire site is only for type courses and materials. And I'm just one instructor there. But there's like a dozen different instructors who we've all been creating materials and to put that up there. And then I have more. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more courses on Udemy that are like 90% done, but all working with other people. So it's all like, getting over the finish line is a hurdle. So finishing that. And so it's hard to say exactly, but I have these deadlines and I want to get over the deadlines. And I did ask for help. And so someone is helping me analyze the data, which I appreciate.
Wow, you sound like an ENTJ right now, Dario. We're all 1 million projects he's doing. It's coming up very ENTJ-ish.
I have to say, I've observed, I had a chance a couple of years ago to hang with the ENTJ in his 30s, early 30s, and just watch him and listen as he did business. And it's funny because I understood everything that he was doing. I just don't want to do it. Like my introverted feeling is just like, no, like we're not doing that. But I totally get it. Like I could step into that spot if I were actually motivated to do it. And that has itself been very motivating. It's like, yeah, I can get like my business and financial picture. I can keep getting that together, and I have for several years. But it was really good to leave academia. That's all I'll say. Like, even though I love teaching, it was a formula that I kept repeating. And even now, like, I have to keep traveling around the world, like, for a few years. Because I bought a house in Arizona. I mean, I already had a house in LA, but I bought a house in Arizona for my mom because she was an ENFJ who never did any extroverted thinking or introverted sensing. And that's what our whole culture operates on. So she had nowhere to live or anything like that. So I'm renting that to her. And then I'm saving money to buy yet another place. And that's forcing me to keep moving all the time, which is really good. So my inner ESFP is stoked because I'm like going to new places and learning new things and like trying new stuff, meeting new people. Here, I'm going to take this very briefly. Hey, man, what's up?
Hey, dude. I think I'm going to head down.
Ooh, excellent.
Maps is telling me to go around, but it should be open, so I'm going to assume it's open, and it should take me a couple hours. If it's not, then I am going to have to go around, and it'll take me longer.
Okay, well, wishing you the best of luck with that. Was that the 210?
He's the coolest.
The 5.
The 5? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I know the weather and everything has been weird, but I think they should be cleared now.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. But like, there's no updates since like 3 days ago on the Twitter page or whatever for Clark and Gorman.
Well,
but I'm gonna assume it's open.
Okay.
Decent weather.
Good. Well, I will keep myself hungry for lunch then. And that's
Okay, cool. I'll make it as soon as I can then.
Oh, no worries. Enjoy your trip, and I'll see you in a couple hours. Looking forward to it.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Happy travels, man.
See
ya.
It's kind of weird to see an INTJ like kind of behave as you do, man. You just it's kind of like you're a mixture between me and like Thomas. It's like he's a mixture, like like very cool. Like some INTJs can be very like anal about everything.
Yeah.
He seems like very like cool, nonchalant, like go with the flow. I just got one last question for you, Dario. What are your thoughts on Enneagram?
I like the Enneagram. Enneagram conferences are more fun than type conferences. I gotta say. I mean, the Enneagram is more about emotions, and in addition to other things. And I think in that sense, it's more fun and feels very relevant to people. I say fun in the sense of like, there's stuff to dig into, and whenever there's emotions and defenses and all of these things, there's something like intriguing and always personal about it, and whatever it is. The way they're arranged on the wheel sort of bothers me. To me, it's like, it's too easy to get carried away with like trying to like tease out a big geometry to it. But I feel like overall, so I don't have like a strong opinion about like, is there a wing system or like tri-types or whatever it is. Like, I don't have a strong opinion about that. But if it helps people think about emotions and defenses and virtues and vices, I think that's great. And so one of the things that got me motivated to do the temperament and interaction styles book is because I was pushed to develop like all this information for each of the 16 types, a write-up on leadership behaviors in 9 categories. Which were not motivated. So those 9 categories were born out of empirical data analysis, not mine, somebody else's. But I was tasked by them to actually write the descriptions. And those 9 look a lot like the Enneagram types. They match up. They're very relevant. So that's actually what sort of pushed that book. And originally I wanted to do a book just on that, like leadership behaviors, with temperament and Enneagram as the intersection. Because I see the Enneagram as something that like plays out in domains like trust, caring. So that trust, caring, openness, speaking up, giving feedback, learning, managing dilemmas, creativity, I'm missing teamwork. So these are all things that are outside, they're in relation to somebody else. Like, do we have trust for other people, and do we trust in ourselves? Care can be care in the sense of like, at the workplace, like I care about how you're doing. It could also mean care in the sense of like, do I care to step out of my pre-assigned role, which is safe, and actually offer to help in a situation that isn't part of my job description or whatever it is. So it was stuff like this. So I really saw it as like a great way to break out of this Enneagram as personality type system, which is not how it started, but how it got sort of taken over and manifested. Because originally, and I do like the Enneagram is about fixations. And I remember the very first time I was exposed to it, I was in my early 20s, and I scored barely as a 1. And I'm like, I don't like being a 1. And then it was like 1, and then the second one was like a 4, and then a 5. And I'm like, well, the 5 is pretty cool. Like, I could see that's part of me. 4, like, I like the creativity, individuality part, but God, that's what makes me neurotic. Like, why would I want that? And then so as I learned about them, I'm like, no, I want to be a 7. 7s have fun. And that was in my time when I was starting to going to therapy and Ericksonian therapy. Milton Erickson, what a genius. Probably ENTP therapist. And really, and I have multiple ENFPs long-term in my life. And I'm like, if I can teach, I want to enjoy it, and I want my students to enjoy it. And the ENFPs are such great entertainers. I mean, they can be entertaining in the same way that Mark Twain, is entertaining. So I literally picked one ENFP in particular I knew, but also if you listen to me and my sister talk on my sister's ENFP preferences, we talk in very similar ways. And I'm like, yeah, so 7 and ENFP. And so I didn't really think about the Enneagram for a long time after that. I just nurtured being a 7. But now that I look at it, and especially with like the subtypes within it, that I'm like, yeah, no, I mean, also fixation of 7 is not great. And well, I would say if people ask me like, Dario, you have a gun to your head, what enneatype are you? I'm like, I'm a 5, wing 4. Like that's, like, I'll just say that, with a lot of love of 7, and I probably could develop 8 and 9 more. I have 0 interest in 2, 3, or 6. But I actually do, like, I feel like I always have 4 in front of me, and I have 6 in my rear view mirror, because I do a lot of things to make sure, like, I have backup plans for stuff. Like when I travel, I pack my backpack for the airplane in the event that my suitcase is lost, which has never actually happened. But in the event that it happens, I'll actually have something to wear and deodorant and like all of these things that I might need. So I do 6, but in a way that's like, it's always like in the background very mildly. And whereas like 4 is like, no, the 4 is the interesting part. Like, yes, I'm gonna like get out my guitar. I'm so frustrated where I am now. I don't have a guitar. But like, yeah, I just like self-expression and like, like that's lovely. I just don't want to be caught in the trap of the 4. And that's, so I think it's really healthy, going away from my personal answer for a minute, to look at all of them and see where our tendencies are and where our deficits are, where people we get put off by. People were like, I think 9s can seem really gentle until you push them too far. And 8s don't need to be, like Donald Trump, I think is a great example of probably an 8 with a bit of 3 in there. But 8, I mean, dude is just like, and then I went to this workshop, Andrea Isaacs, who's fantastic. And she knows type, but she mostly uses Enneagram. And we got to practice. It was an all-day workshop, but for a third of the day, we pick an enneatype that's not us. And she gave us a cheat sheet that we go through of practices on how to be that enneatype, how to practice that within us. And so I practiced 8. And I'm like, oh, wow, like 8 can also arrive at the point where they have such strength and confidence that they know they can afford to be generous and gentle. They just have to get that through their mind, like that they're strong enough, like the tree that has really taken root and like can weather any storm, that it too can be sheltering and give shade. Like it doesn't need to be like bully tree. It can be like friendly, happy, giving tree. And that's, so just to even go through that process of like arriving at that point and then experiencing like, oh, if I were an 8, what were the lessons that I would need to face? And including she would have us practice the bad parts of it too, which was really interesting. So practice being a bit of a bully. And we got up on stage. We did skits. Like it was great. Like I really loved it. And it was so funny. I did get into it because I decided in another third of the day, I was practicing being a 4. Because she was like, you pick your type or a type that is like, your wing. And I'm like, well, 5, 4, I'm going to pick 4. And somebody right as we were doing the 4, we're like getting into the mode and preparing our skit as 4s. And most of the people there like were 4 solidly, or otherwise they were 4 wing. And somebody came up to me and he was like, you're not a 4. And I immediately had a 4 reaction of like, fuck off. Like, who are you to tell me who I am? Like really, I felt like really like I had like an infj moment, like really like offended that somebody would disrespect me enough. And I'm like, how dare you tell me who I am? And that's in this like very like, I don't know. It was just, I would say because the emotion was all about the interpersonal dynamic that was happening. And that was such an interesting experience. So I think the Enneagram, when people step away, and this would be my thing that I want to say to all INTPs who like type, I'm like, sometimes you need to step away from the model because personality has the word person in it. And the model is everywhere and always about you and other people. So if the person, which I've met several young INTPs who are offended when they do something and I point out how the type model is applying to them in this moment. And obviously, like, then it becomes, they're experiencing NI as a critic. And I get that. But on the other hand, I'm like, personality, they're like, oh no, like, we should only talk about the model. I'm like, the model is about people, and therefore it's about you and me, but it's about people. Like, that's the way it is. I think if we drop some of the obsession with the definitions and categories and the mental model and all of that, and just like allow ourselves to experience it. And so I think that's where coaching can be so great with type, is when there's coaching stuff that allows us to experience the different functions, that really experiences like people of different temperament, interaction styles. I love how there are some coaches who do interaction styles, like Susan Nash. Like, she demos each interaction style. Like, she comes through the door, she'll leave the room, and she'll come in through the door each time with a different interaction style. And you can see it in the body language and all of that, which reminds us, yeah, it's got a behavioral component, but it's also like a real thing. And then people laugh and they have fun with it. And there's my, inner ESFP talking about it. But I do believe that Enneagram has, one of its really wonderful strengths is the experiential aspect as well as the clinical aspect of it. Because it is about emotions and defenses. But the experiential part, and that's why I said, like, their conferences are just more fun.
Thank you, Dario. Thomas, you got anything else?
Maybe just, I think you talked about this last time, but I'm kind of, I'd like to, I guess, have my brain scanned. So I'm curious, I live in Florida. Is that something that could be done here, or where could that be done?
I think you said Orlando.
Yes, it can be done in Florida.
Because of Personality Hacker, right?
Yes, yeah. So it turns out Personality Hacker this year is doing their East Coast event in Pittsburgh rather than Orlando, for whatever reason. So that the times I'll be doing brain imaging this year, besides whenever I'm in Norway, and then it's in Oslo. If people want to go to France, my business partner there, ISFP, is, he offers brain imaging, does a great job of it. He's been getting more people than I have recently, which is great. And he developed an entire website where we can just upload the data and it creates the report in like 1 second instead of me spending 30 minutes. So very stoked about that. So you can go to France. This year, I will be doing brain imaging at the Personality Hacker event in Pittsburgh. And that's at the end of May. Then I will be doing it again 2 weeks later at the British Type Conference in London. And that's like the weekend of the 16th, 17th, something like that. There is some quiet news, potential possibility that Personality Hacker will be having a European General Type Weekend in Amsterdam that third week in June. And I will definitely be offering it then, because they have a lot of fans in Europe and they're not going to put on a whole 1 week event, but like 2 or 3 days. We just talked about that a few days ago. So there would happen then. I will be doing brain imaging when I come back to Los Angeles sometime later in the year, probably August, before going to Burning Man, which is on my to-do list. And then Seattle for sure, because the Seattle Type Association is like, you're coming. We're going to make everything work for you. And then in Tokyo and Singapore later in the year. Whether that's September, October hasn't quite shaped up yet, but one of those two. So where Florida, unfortunately, is not on the list this year. Okay. International travel, I realize, is expensive. But they're at least on the East Coast. It's just like I don't run a business now of doing brain imaging. Like, it was always a side thing for gathering data, and then it's a great thing to do at events. Like the last time I went to Paris, I did 20 people in 3 days. And so sometimes it's just like, yeah, there's a big impetus to do a lot of people at once. But yeah, if you know people in Florida, and I'm sure Personality Hacker will return to Florida. So that's an option. Or if you want to come to Pittsburgh that Saturday, Sunday, they'll be selling tickets. So that's an option. Yeah.
Yeah, we're both in
Unfortunately, yeah,
Florida.
it's not around more. And in terms of working with other people and like building a network, I'm not an ENTJ, so it's just other things take priority. And, I did, in all fairness, so I did do a business analysis. And the problem with brain imaging as a business and getting investor funding for it and all of that is that it is very labor intensive. It's not the cost of the equipment or the speed of getting reports, or like all of those are solvable problems and have been solved. Or even finding ways to pitch it to organizations is just really labor intensive, and is something to invest in and build as a business. Like other forms of passive income, like building interactive training simulations that people can just go sign up for and are run automatically on the internet, is such a better profit avenue than brain imaging. Like it's just, and that's what I'm working on now, is because for the whole year I've like been building these simulations, and some of them are type-based simulations. So like, yeah, you want to go on a date with an ESTP or INFJ or whatever, you can do that with a virtual character. You want to do type profiling, but you don't have real people that you're sure of their type. Well, if you were sure of their type, then how would you do profiling? Well, we can do it with game characters. And simply build game characters that you can interact with and then type them, and get your practice profiling that way. What about therapy? You know, that's you can either practice coaching, or you can say, I'm going to go to a coach and I'm going to put in, oh, my type is INTJ, and there's like a sequence that you can go through. So we could say like it's virtual coaching, or it's automated coaching.
Wow.
And then that's beautiful, because once those things are built, then they're resources, they're like digital courses, and then they just automatically go. And that's, so my ENTJ hat has been on in that respect.
Yeah, he definitely sounds like an ENTJ. He's like, oh man, this. I'm like, whoa. Even for me, I'm like, whoa, that's a lot. You know?
Yeah, and it's all part of like a 5-year plan, and I'm at the beginning of year 3, so it's still like slow. It's slow going. When I came out with the book in 2011, there was an ENFP who approached me who's like, you can go into businesses now and this and that and da-da-da. And I'm like, dude, it's going to take me at least another 10 years. Like quality takes time, like research takes time, all of this stuff, learning how to market, what people will respond to. That's a great thing. The ISFP, I'm working with great aesthetic sense and good at marketing. Also a programmer and a surfer. And so we have lots of things in common. And just, so it's actually great to work with somebody who's very different type and moving in this direction. So I know people do ask me, where can I do brain imaging? I still have 2 people who've called me to get back to them to say Pittsburgh or Seattle this year, or Los Angeles.
Well.
Yeah. I would like to do a tour, one of the East Coast and one of the West Coast, with like some jumping a little way in between. That would be like, it's like the brain imaging van. So it's like my business partner, Adrian, and I will just like drive down and we'll do brain imaging at each of the cities that has an APT like type chapter or a large like personality hacker following. And like, we'll just do at each location over the course of a couple of weeks, go from like Boston to Miami. And I'd love to do that. Not this year, but yeah. No, because there's a lot of logistics involved, and it's a big expense, like to do that kind of thing, and to manage all people getting registered and making sure that they show up, and like which cities are we going to go to, and like researching hotels and Or do we like sleep in the? Is it like an RV and we sleep in the RV? Like, how is it going to work?
That's
like, yeah.
It's kind of crazy because my brain already shifts to the outcome, and your brain like shifts to like how do things work. And like me and Thomas were talking about that a lot. Like Thomas will be like, and I think that's the reason why ENTJs just do things, because they look at the end product and they just jump at the end product. As in like somebody like yourself was like, there's a million different things that like happens before that. But I'm just like, okay, we're gonna turn this into something, you know. You're like, you gotta do X, Y, Z, you gotta do this, that, like this, and I'm just like, you like overloaded me there. And I'm like, oh man, I kind of see why like a lot of INTJs would be like, I don't want to do this, and I'm just like, no, exactly. let's just do this. And they're like,
yeah, and it's a big. So I think that way, and then I'm like, which serves me really well in say writing a book or a computer program. But the moment I'm like, oh, I have to call these people, and there are lots of internet resources today, and I know the answer is to actually hire somebody who also will split the profits with us, and that person is going to be an extrovert, and yet also diligent. Like I don't know, like ask an ENFJ, for example, to like do all of that arranging and all of that kind of stuff, or ESFP. So I know it's like I don't have to do it myself, but my brain wants to do it myself and jumps to all those things. And it's, yes.
INTJ problems. Well, thank you, Dario. It was a pleasure to talk to you. It's great. It's always a wealth of knowledge. I'm about to watch this back like 3 or 4 times to kind of get everything you said.
Definitely.
But it's always a pleasure, Dario. You have a great day.
Thank you. You too as well. Thank you. Yeah, good chat. Cheers.